Welcome everyone to another CTC Software webinar. My name is Sean Zerbis, the Director of BIM Development here at CTC Software, and today we are going to be continuing with the HIVE CMS Admin Learning Series, focusing very much today on how to work with your Revit preview generation settings. So we'll be focusing exclusively on Revit stuff today as it relates to the HIVE CMS, so this won't apply to AutoCAD. Now also, of course, as always, we pay very close attention to the questions window. So if you have a question, I encourage you to throw it in there. And also, we are recording this webinar. So if you want to come back and refer to this in the future, we encourage you to go to our YouTube channel, subscribe there, and be notified, and be able to save that playlist for the HIVE CMS Admin Learning Series for yourself, so you can review it whenever you need to. We feel like there's some pretty good quality content in there for you. All right, let's jump into today's topic. I got to get my presentation window pulled forward because for whatever reason, it went behind everything, as things do when you're about to present something, right? That's just how stuff goes. All right. So before adding content into HIVE, since we're talking about previews today, it really is a good idea to kind of plan out what you want all of your end users to be seeing, what kind of graphic image they're going to be seeing when they are looking for, searching for your content, and that content preview shows up on a page. I mean, there's all kinds of different options you can have. If you're dealing with doors, for example, maybe you want them to be shaded in an elevation view explicitly and you don't want the wall turned on. Maybe for furniture, you want it to be in a 3D view and you want it realistic, and maybe you want it to have the materialization shown. So it's actually kind of doing a rendering there, like a light rendering, a realistic display. No matter what it is, you got to make sure that you tell HIVE ahead of time what you want your previews to be, or you save that preview image ahead of time in the family, and HIVE can pull the preview image from the family itself. Either way. Regardless, we're going to show you today exactly how you can control all of the preview generation settings that are built into HIVE for anything that's a Revit family file, an RFA. So we're going to go through all those settings in this session. So we're going to take a look at if family previews get created, when they get created, and kind of a bit about how they're generated, of course. We're going to toggle some different settings for the family preview creation. We're going to customize also family preview settings for specific Revit categories or specific Revit host types so that you can very explicitly control exactly how previews are controlled and generated on demand if you're using the auto generation of previews. And we're also going to talk a little bit about manually replacing previews on any piece of content that's in HIVE and why you might want to choose to do that and why that might tie back to the if and when family previews are generated and kind of how all those controls work together. Now, since I'm not big on death by PowerPoint, I am, of course, going to be doing all of this live today, and I'm going to encourage you to follow along with some of your settings, taking a look at what it is you have configured within your HIVE CMS, assuming you're a HIVE CMS admin or an organization admin. I'll be showing you all these settings. So first off, we're going to take a look at controlling the preview generation settings, and we're going to be doing this from the portal because that's where this setting is actually controlled. For the core preview generation settings. You can go to ctcsoftware.com. Now, if you happen to not be at your desk and you want to use your iPad or your iPhone, your Android phone, your kid's Chromebook, it doesn't matter. If you've got a web browser, you can do some of this administration. I'm going to pull forward ctcsoftware.com. I happen to already be authenticated. I'm signed in as myself here in the CTC Express Tools little fake account that I have set up for me here. And I'm going to be navigating specifically to the CMS tab. This is where we're going to be controlling the preview generation settings for, well, the CMS. That's kind of where those settings are controlled. I'm going to be jumping into the settings here, and this is an organization-wide setting. So I'm going to be modifying the organization settings here. The two settings that are the most important for today's discussion as it relates to previews is down here on the bottom right corner underneath content settings. There is an option to completely disable automatic preview generation. What this does is it turns off all the features I'll be showing in a moment here. If you check this box, what Hive will do when you're processing content in is it will exclusively use the preview that is saved on the family itself, already in the family, as an RFA. When you browse in Windows to go find a Revit family, that's the preview that Hive will use when it's opening up, scanning the family, and then putting a preview up online. Okay, so it'll use that. However, if you want to have a bit better control over the previews, then in that case, you're going to want to uncheck this and take a look at the rest of the settings that we'll be talking about here through the rest of the session. There's times, however, when you may have intentionally overridden a preview, or you don't want a preview to change at all for some reason. You can check the box, use existing preview, and then what Hive will do, first off, when you're first uploading a family or first uploading content, it will create a preview and push that to the family, with whichever rules you're using, either using the automatic preview generation settings, or if you check the box here, using the ones that are already in the family. But it will generate a preview on the first processing of a piece of content. And then after that, if you have this box checked, use existing preview, it will never generate another preview until you uncheck this, if the family or piece of content has already been discovered. So with this checked, it'll continue to use whatever preview is already there. Those are two really important settings because everything that I'm about to show moving forward relies upon these two being set the way that you want. Again, if you check this, you could stop right now. Like, you're kind of done. If you uncheck this and you want auto preview generation, then seeing kind of how that's going to affect when you reprocess content is affected by this guy right here. If you make a change to these, make sure you hit save, and then we can jump over into the Hive CMS and actually begin working over there. So I'm going to minimize this, and we are going to take a look here at the controlling of the default settings now. Within Hive itself, what are the default configuration settings here? So I'm going to pull Hive to the foreground, and we're going to go take a look at where these default settings are. Now, just to be clear, I'm not going to be processing any new content today. We're just talking about settings. If you want to see how we actually add and process content, I have a full webinar that was already done on that. I encourage you to check that out on our YouTube channel here. But, oops, I let it go to the background because I clicked the background PowerPoint here. I'm just resizing it so I can get on screen what I want on screen. Okay. The setting that we are looking for here is this one right here, Content Processor Settings. This is the button that we're seeking. It's on the Add Content tab. If you have CMS admin rights, you should be able to get to this. Content Processor Settings here. If I have my window expanded wide enough, everything will be on one row. It's the second to last icon here on the little control bar there. So, Content Processor Settings. This is the dialog we seek. Inside of this, there's a number of different processor settings that relate to not Revit content, just common file properties that are going to be scanned, or origin file properties, like some origin things about Word documents and items like that that can be scanned, or media file things if you're processing MP3s or WAV files and those types of items up. Some of the properties from that could be scanned and used as metadata that becomes searchable. This is not the focus of today. Today we're talking about preview settings, and so we want to go specifically to the Revit Settings tab. And then from here, we're going into the Revit Family Preview Generator Settings sub-tab. And there's two tabs here that control everything about the previews that Hive generates automatically if you allow it to do so, depending on those previous settings. The first one here is visibility settings that pretty much affect almost every single family. Things like enabling preview visibility. This is really meaningful if you're dealing with annotation symbols or detail items, 2D objects generally, or if you're doing a lot with visibility controls on solids within a family. Those don't always turn themselves graphically off, but if you check Enable Preview Visibility, what this will let you do is have it sort of set that option, and whatever parameters are set in the family, it'll actually show you explicitly that and actually hide or turn off the graphics that are supposed to be turned off. Not just gray them out, but turn them off. And it generates, in my opinion, a better looking preview when you use this. But sometimes you may not want to do that. Maybe you want like 3D objects. Maybe it's going to be mechanical equipment, for example, and you want to show the ghosting of the options that might be available. So maybe you don't want this turned on, right? That's up to you, of course. There's also the ability to leverage smooth edges. This is important if you're doing things like showing realistic. The smooth edges can be really nice, especially with glass type materials. It just looks a little better with that anti-aliasing. There's a lot of items here. If you're doing a lot of two-dimensional views, the dimensions, the reference planes, the reference lines, potentially levels for an elevation style view, text notes, all of these different types of things here, you may want to show them. By default, they tend to show in previews. I don't like showing them. So personally, most of these items I turn off. Flip controls. So if you have a hosted object, you have the option of using flip controls. The room calculation point, that green squiggly line that comes up. The host element itself, the wall, the floor, the face that the object is hosted to, that host element, you can control it. If there's MEP connectors, you may not want to see those. I know that electrical connectors, they don't really resize to the family. They just show this big green circle. And in a lot of cases, if I have a light switch or an outlet, that big green circle kind of makes my preview not look so good. So I tend to not show connector elements ever, personally. Void objects, solids that are voids that cut when you place the object, you might not want to show that because it's not really a part of the family. It's more just a cut of the, a cutting object. Light sources and lighting fixtures, those can be really distracting. That photometric web, that orange graphic that's out there sometimes doesn't let you see what the actual lighting fixture is supposed to look like, and that can be kind of distracting. So I like to turn that off. This one's sort of under dispute. Some people like it, some don't. I don't like showing CAD objects at all. Imported elements, I don't like showing them in my families. I feel that families should really be true 3D parametric elements when it's a 3D object. So I tend to not show the imported objects, but if your family's entire geometry is an imported CAD file or a DXF, then you may need to show this if you're just placing, say, a block into the model. So that's going to be up to you to determine whether or not you want to see that. Also, with recent versions of Revit, there's the ability to change your background colors to a couple of different things, and those background colors can be distracting as well. So for previews in HIVE, I find that the white background tends to look the best. So you can actually force this to set a white background while HIVE is generating previews, and that way, no matter what the background was in your Revit, it will set it to white, then do the preview capture, and then it will turn it back to whatever your typical background color is, right? Now, the only time this does not apply, as you notice the note here, it does not apply that when we're doing a rendering or a realistic display. It kind of has sort of a gray gradient background, and you might see that sometimes in your families, okay? So that's the general settings. There's also default appearance settings, and that's right here, the default appearance. This default appearance primarily affects 3D objects, but it also has a small effect on 2D elements as well, especially like detail items. So the scale here affects anything that can be affected by scale. The display units, I'm just going to work my way sort of from the bottom up. The display units here are going to control what scale list options you see. If I go to metric, for example, I'll see metric scale options. If I go to imperial, I see the standardized imperial scale options. Generally, for most of my families, I tend to pick either a 3-inch or a 1.5 inch to a foot scale. I find that gives me the best line weights graphic when it's capturing a preview for the size of the image it will be for most of my families. There's going to be times I might want to override that, but by default, since we're talking the default appearance, that's generally pretty decent. I also tend to almost always use a fine detail level that shows all of the solids, shows all the graphic representation of items that I typically would want to see at the highest detail level. But you could, of course, scale that back if you wanted to by default, if you wanted to see much more simplistic graphics. Sometimes I know, like in electrical, a fine detail level might show the solids of the, say, outlet boxes and switch boxes, while also showing the two-dimensional sort of plan scalable symbology. And maybe you only want to see the plan scalable symbology and you don't want to see the solids. So maybe in annotation symbols or for electrical devices, you might want to see a coarse detail level. But most of the time, you're probably going to want to see fine. We'll talk about kind of fine-tuning that in a little bit here as well. By default, what display style do you like to see on your content? Personally, I'm a big fan of shaded with edges. I like this for most of my content, but certainly there's times when showing a rendering or showing realistic information might be better. Maybe consistent colors might be better. Realistic with edges is a popular item to use sometimes. So it really depends on what it is you prefer. A lot of MEP content, I'm probably going to do shaded with edges, maybe hidden line only. A lot of architectural and interiors content, I'll probably be going more for realistic or realistic with edges. But that's up to you, right? That's why it's an option here. For the view angle, you can choose your default view angle for everything that's going to be processed if a view angle is possible. And that's also true of display style, if display style is possible. It's not, for example, relevant when I'm doing detail items or annotation symbols. There's no display style there. There's also no view angle for those two things. There's no view angle for profiles, as an example. But if there is a view angle available, you can choose what you want that view angle to be. I know a lot of people tend to use something like 3D right front top. That's a popular one. Or 3D left front top. That's another popular one. But there's certainly times when you might want something else. But these are the defaults. You just configure the default appearance so that it works for the vast majority of your content. In my case, I like 3D right front top as my default, and so I'm going to set that. Shaded with edges, fine, and 1.5 inch equals a foot is my default view scale. And just so I don't lose my settings that I've modified here, I'm going to go ahead and hit save. It's going to save my settings, it's going to close this dialog, and then it's going to go ahead and I'll pop it back open here with the content processor settings and just navigate down that path one more time so you know where to go. Revit settings, Revit family preview generator settings, the general options, as well as the appearance settings right here. These are the two areas where we're kind of controlling here the default settings for our system. Now, I'm going to close that for a minute, and I'm going to let my PowerPoint come back to the foreground here because we're now going to transition off of controlling the default settings and start talking more about host-specific settings or even category-specific settings. We're going to start really narrowing this down and refining this so that every time I'm doing, say, mechanical equipment, I can get the exact same representation for that. And every time I'm doing electrical equipment, I don't have to worry about transitioning and saving different settings because it will already know all of those settings. So we're going to talk about host-specific settings now at this point. So back here in the HIVE CMS, one more time, I'm going to open up those content processor settings, Revit settings, Revit family preview generator settings, appearance settings. And here, if I expand this box just a bit more here, you'll notice that on the bottom, there's the ability to control by category. And not only by category, but within the categories, I have the ability to control by hosting type. Now, a lot of my host types are already pulled out of this list because once I assign a different preview graphic for, say, air terminals that are wall hosted or air terminals that are face-based, once I have that set, it pulls it out of this list so that that particular category and hosting configuration has a specific appearance and can't have some other appearance conflicting with it. So to make a brand new appearance template here, I'm going to click on this little new appearance template. Or if there was one that I wanted to edit, of course, I could hit the edit option, the little pencil button. Or if I had one that was like very garbage and I didn't like it and I want to just delete it real quick, I could delete all of that using the delete option here. So in this case, I'm going to make a brand new one because we're talking about building a brand new host type. So I'm going to build some roof graphics here to kind of configure how it is I want to see elements that are roof hosted specifically. So maybe I have air terminals or fans that might be roof hosted, and maybe I've got mechanical equipment that might be roof hosted. I probably wouldn't because roof hosting is a bad idea in the world of MEP since I don't typically have my own roofs, but we're going to use this as the example since I have a lot of other items that are already kind of configured, and we'll go take a look at some of those. In this case, I'm going to call it out explicitly as roof hosted. And you can notice I have the names down here, wall-hosted, face-based, ceiling-based, generic models, right? This is just a specific category that's unhosted in this case. That's my hosting type. I've got some different configured graphics for those. In this case, this is just roof-hosted in general. Now, one thing that you can do if you want to is 100% just disable preview generation for this category and host type. Maybe you've already gone through and done a whole bunch of work for a particular category. Maybe your doors look great and you want exactly what the door preview shows on every family, whether it's right or not. That's what you want it to be. So you could choose something like disable preview generation and then just click OK. There's nothing else needed because it's just not going to do previews for anything that's put into this group. In fact, what I'd probably do is name this no preview at that point. And then I could throw a bunch of categories and hosting types into that no preview group if that's what I really wanted. So I don't have to disable it for everything, but for some things, I might want to disable that. Maybe I'm doing all replacement options, replacing graphics. We're going to talk about how to do that in a minute. Maybe I want to do that for every piece of kitchen equipment, and that's it. So maybe that's specialty equipment that's unhosted, and I want all those elements to never have preview generation. So I might make an unhosted or a no preview group for that, but everything else maybe has some kind of a preview that it auto-generates, right? You can leverage this for that purpose. If this is unchecked, however, you can now go in and start to control what you want the rest of the settings to be. The same settings we had out here for the default appearance, I can make them different for roof-hosted objects. Like maybe roof-hosted elements, I want the view angle to look at it in floor plan view, always in floor plan view, straight down. Or maybe I want this to look at it from an elevation view for whatever reason. I could do that. So, or I want it to be a different 3D orientation. There's reasons to do that as well. Or maybe I want it to be exactly the same. If I wanted exactly the same, of course, I would set it the same. 3D right front top, which is probably what I am going to do. 3D right front top is what I'm going to set up here so I can see this in a 3D view. Maybe this one I want to see explicitly in hidden line for some reason, for whatever reason. And maybe I want to see this at a coarse detail level, so it's not going to be the fine detail level that everything else is. I'm going to be, again, using my imperial scales because in my case, that's what I'm most familiar with, but you could, of course, use whatever scale methodology you wanted. And then finally, I'm going to pick whatever scale it is that I need. So maybe roof-hosted objects tend to be bigger, physically larger elements. And so because of that, maybe I want to do a bigger scale so my line weights get heavier and those lines on the outside of my hidden line graphics don't wash out so bad. Maybe 1/2 inch equals a foot works really well for my roof-hosted larger equipment versus the default of 1.5 inches for everything else, where maybe this might be a little too fine of a line style and it might lose some fidelity when it's creating the preview, right, and showing it to me in the Hive space. So I might want to change that. That's up to you, though. It's going to take you testing it a little bit, trying it out, seeing what you like, processing a piece of content in, looking at what it looks like, and then making some changes to make it something either more coarse or perhaps even more fine, depending on what you want that preview to look like for that general category of object. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK on this. That's going to create the definition in here for the appearance types. Roof hosted is sitting right here. It doesn't have a little plus sign in front of it because I just made a template, appearance configuration, but nothing's in here yet. So maybe I want all of my air terminals that are roof hosted, whenever I come across one of these, to automatically associate to this. And so I can throw my roof-hosted air terminals into here, and then they will show up in 3D right front top, hidden line, at the right scale. Everything's going to be good to go. There might be other items in this list that I want as well. For example, maybe I want mechanical equipment that might be roof-hosted to show a certain way. So I can grab this roof-hosted object here, throw that in the list. Maybe I've got access panels on the door, and those might be access panels that might be doors that are hosted to a roof instead of hosting them to a wall, like it's a lift open hatch, for example. So maybe I want to go find doors, the door category, there they are, and I want the roof hosted doors to be going into this roof hosted object as well. So I can simply add that across into here. So any air terminals, any doors, any mechanical equipment, they're going to use these rules for these roof hosted objects to be kind of scaling and setting their graphics a specific way. See, normally, talking about doors that are roof-hosted, these show in a 3D view, right? That's the way that I have this set up. Normally, if I had wall-hosted objects, up here my wall-hosted elements, I tend to show those objects elevation front. And in fact, if I edit the settings here, because you can always edit one of these settings, pull this back across on screen, This is elevation front. I'm using consistent colors for this one. That's the option that I've chosen to use. Fine detail level, and for this, for whatever reason, I've chosen a 1 foot equals 1 foot scale, so it's a 1-to-1 scale. That's actually a bit too fine for doors. I'm not a big fan of that, so I'm actually going to change that and make it something more like the default scale is probably good. 1.5 inch equals a foot is probably going to be fine for these doors, and they'll probably look just fine. Now, I may very well want to take this view scale and adjust it after I process a door or two. I might not like it. I might want to switch it back, but at least, I have the control for these wall-hosted elements, anything in this list, to be able to control them explicitly. Now, you may want to get more fidelity. You might want to have wall-hosted architectural elements show one way and wall-hosted mechanical objects show a different way, wall-hosted electrical show yet another way. You can do that. It's just new templates and just be more explicit with your naming convention and then use those categories, throw them into that correct wall-hosted style configuration so that you can have the right orientation, the right scale, the right everything that you want. So that's how these settings work for controlling host-specific settings inside of here. So again, I can save these changes. Every single piece of content that I process out here from this point forward will use those settings when it generates previews, and because of how I have my organization settings here, where I am not using existing previews and I'm not disabling that automatic preview generation, every single time that I create process content into Hive, it will use those settings and it will apply them to the families. It will generate a preview consistently. Even if the family wasn't saved right, it will create the good, consistent, correct preview for it because of how I have my settings configured here. Now, there's certainly times when I might want to change this, and I'm going to show you an example right now of why you might want to sometimes use the existing preview when you're processing content. So we're going to talk now about manual preview replacement. This is sometime when you're in there and you've processed some content in and maybe the preview looks really, really bad. Or maybe no preview that's of any good quality could be generated. There's a lot of system families in Revit that don't have previews that are any good. Stairs and railings is a really good example. Model groups is another one. There's no way to automatically extract a good quality preview from a model group in a Revit model, especially if it's not placed. So you may want to go in there and intentionally manually replace that preview. Of course, depending on your settings, the next time you process content up, it might get replaced if it's that same piece of content, and you might want to disable that, and that's why I wanted you to be very aware of this use existing preview option here, because you may be toggling that off and on. But let's jump into Hive and actually take a look at manually replacing a preview. I'm going to squish this down a little bit. I'm just going to run a search. Let's collapse my details here in this case, and I'm going to intentionally search for groups. So model groups in my case is what I want to find. I'm going to apply a search, see what shows up. In fact, let's only show Revit content, and let's only show model groups out of the, IMI library that I have here. Okay, this is a good example of previews that have already been replaced. So these actually look pretty good. These were previews that were captured by me. I actually did screenshots in Revit, saved an image, and or I printed a JPEG or printed a PNG, and I now have a really quality image that's been placed on top of these particular model groups right here. But that's not always the case. Now, I don't have a really good preview for this next example that I'm going to show you, but I'm going to go ahead and just show some groups that come out of our MEP productivity pack when they just get processed in, right? Nothing in here has any previews. That's the default graphic for groups because Revit doesn't give us anything at all. So what you could do, I'm just going to scroll down a little ways here. I'm going to pick something at random, this guy. I can select this, and when I pick on it, right-click on it. If you're an admin, you have the ability to intentionally assign a custom preview image. This gives you an image picker right here. So I can go into my pictures. I'm just going to use my little IMI library right here. And I'll just pick one of the ones that I had already picked from the IMI stuff that I had done recently. But I can replace that preview. Now, the next time that I run a search, if I just reapply this here, it'll take it a second to actually apply that to the actual piece of content here, but there we go. The next time someone's looking for this particular thing, it will have that specific manually set preview on it. Now, the next time I process this group in, it's going to replace that preview. Again, remember that, unless, of course, when I'm processing model groups, I pre-check the use existing preview and save it, then process all my model groups, then I don't risk losing my previews. It's just a good idea to remember to come back and turn this back off again for the next time you're processing, say, Revit family RFA content that, can generate nice quality previews for you. All right, I think that's all I have for preview generation. We've talked for about a half hour on the topic, so for those of you who are not going to hang out for the Q&A session, I want to start by saying thank you. We always appreciate when you show up live and have the opportunity to interact with us. We, of course, did record this webinar, and this will be going up to our YouTube channel, so we encourage you to go over there and subscribe to that. We also have a lot of really good new events coming up here really soon. We hope you subscribe and sign up for those events, talking about a lot of new features, a lot of new HIVE functionality coming up real soon here. So take a look at our events page on the ctcsoftware.com website and sign up for those as well.